Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. This passage, when Jesus will give a new commandment to love one another, is where Judas has left, and an intimacy comes into the band with Jesus. And all the important things that will be developed up to and including John 17 are encapsulated in this short reading from verses 31 to 35. Small and yet so important. Where I am going, you cannot come. That seems so counterintuitive because the Gospels start with, follow me. If you think of John's Gospel, they just get up and go with Jesus. It's, what do you want? Jesus asks them, and they say, are you the one? They want to know, and he says, come and see. Follow me. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples are always learning to follow Jesus. And in fact, when you look at the gospel stories, the whole gospel itself, it's Jesus's call and the disciples following. These women and men who say to Jesus, show us. And we hear how the 12 are formed, and then we hear the women who have supported them financially and in other ways through their journeying. Follow me. And Christians from the beginning of time have followed Jesus. So when Jesus says, where I am going, you cannot come, it seems so counterintuitive. How can we not go with Jesus? He's asked us to follow him. And when we read the stories in the gospel of the prelude to Jesus' passion, his death on the cross, his crucifixion, in fact, the disciples seem to disappear. They abandon Jesus. We have Peter denying Jesus. We have that strange character, the young man in Mark's gospel, who twists out of his clothes and runs off rather than following Jesus. But here in John's gospel, Jesus says, you cannot follow me now. Where I am going, you cannot come. So I was reflecting on this, I was thinking of my granddaughter, who's 4 years old, who has to get used to the idea that mummy will leave her at daycare or leave her somewhere else, but mummy is going to leave her. And part of growing up is learning how to be left. That when somebody leaves us, it's going to be okay. But it's a big journey. And all through our lives, we will have times when we will feel quite abandoned. You have gone and I could not follow you. I see this so often in grief. When a beloved partner has died and there's this aching sense of, I can't follow you. I want to follow you. And you've gone and you didn't stay. And sometimes that aching grief can be incredibly angry. How could you leave me? And in those moments, life can become quite lonely. All our lives, we are faced with situations where either we or someone else will go and can't be followed. So here in this beginning of Jesus' discourses, as they're called, as he starts to teach in preparation for the trial and crucifixion, and then the resurrection, which we're celebrating, we have this sense of Jesus preparing his disciples, preparing them for his going and getting them ready for what they must do. Now, Jesus has just washed his disciples' feet, and Judas has left, and it is night. Darkness has descended. And Jesus now starts to teach. When Jesus washed his disciples' feet, which is the context of today's reading, interestingly, it's paralleled in the chapter before, when Mary of Bethany gets the pound of quantity of costly perfume, nard from the Himalayas, and wipes it on Jesus' feet, and then wipes Jesus' feet with her hair, and the smell just goes everywhere and transforms the room. And Judas doesn't like it. And then Jesus, paralleling what Mary has done, Mary's act of enormous love, Jesus then gets the towel and the bowl and washes his disciples' feet. They're resistant. But he says, you must let me do it in order for me to be part of you and you to be part of me. So all of this has happened. And then Jesus talks about his glorification. In John's Gospel, the glorification of the hour that John's been talking about all through his Gospel is when Jesus is lifted on the cross, and the cross is no longer the failure of this man who is also the Son of God. The cross is no longer the shame and the disappointment. The cross is no longer the mission and relationship of Jesus to his Father is no longer that being destroyed, but now the cross is the culmination of everything that God is doing through his Son, Jesus Christ. Where I am going, you cannot come. And because we cannot come, and in part it means that we live between the resurrection and when Jesus will return, and in part it means that because what Jesus has inaugurated, has started with his resurrection, is the first fruits, as St. Paul says it, and so it is it is something that we are starting to experience but haven't got it in full until that day when Jesus returns and brings it all together. Where I am going, you cannot come, but we now have a sense of what we must be. And how must we be? Well, we must be the people who do as Jesus did. We must love one another as he has loved us. Isn't it strange how the moment we start to love, our whole perspective changes? Even in the worst moments, when we start to love and we know ourselves being loved, a hopefulness comes within us that allows us to see a horizon that is amazing. And for Christians, knowing Jesus Christ, knowing him crucified and risen, knowing him as the one who abides in our hearts, the one who calls us, that gives us such a wonderful sense of connection and belonging that in this world's darkness, we can have hope. And we show our hope in the overflowing of our love. Where I am going, you cannot come. But we, who are the ones who are formed by Jesus, learn how to love. We learn how to love by our service. We learn how to love by washing each other's feet. We learn how to love by allowing others to wash our feet. And in this holding on to who Jesus is, from the beginning of the gospel right to the end of the gospel, this holding on to Jesus, who Jesus is and what he means to us, starts to transform us. And we have a hopefulness even in this darkness and these troubled times. I was recently thinking of the idea of an algorithm. And I hope this isn't too corny, but the idea, when you go onto YouTube or anything like that, as soon as you click on a video, the computer algorithm starts saying, oh yes, you like that, and starts giving us stuff. And so you keep getting videos of all of those things rather than other videos. And that can be quite sinister, and we've seen how people can be radicalized by that. But there's something about our faith that the more we do the Jesus stuff, from the beginning of the gospel to the end, especially this loving service, this algorithm of faith transforms us. and gives us a deep and wonderful sense of hope that in the midst of life and in death and in suffering, in the midst of joy and in sorrow, in the midst of failure, we always have hope because we keep working out the stuff of Jesus. So one commentator, Margaret Daly Denton, says, so the love command to be obeyed is actually the whole story of Jesus, calling for a see and do likewise response. I want to basically finish with a quote from David Ford's commentary on John. He says, when he says, Jesus says, as I have done, so you must do for one another. He says, as is for the wider, and encourages reflection on the whole gospel. To obey this command, readers need to reread the gospel as asking two leading questions. How is Jesus loving here? And how might this inspire our loving now? I encourage you to reread all of John's gospel and ask those two questions that David Ford presents. How is Jesus loving here? And how might this inspire our loving now? And allow this algorithm to take hold more and more deeply, and the divine hope of salvation to transform our living and our loving, our dying by Jesus, who is our hope.